r/NoSleep. Hosted by you/CharlieIg92. The Toe Witch. Everyone's heard of the Toe Witch in one way or another. Names will probably vary from city to city, country to country. The story is quite simple: don't hang your feet out the bottom of the bed or they will get gobbled up, chopped off, or something equally horrid. I grew up in a small village, miles from the nearest city. We had a school, local shops and markets, one doctor's surgery, no hospital and a pub. Miles of forest surrounded our village, situated between two tall hills and a vast lake. Pretty ideal and beautifully picturesque. On occasion, we would get hardened hikers passing through, but apart from that, we were tucked away from the rest of the world. Most of the people were elderly. Younger families often moved back to the village to raise children, and when they grew into adults, they would move to pursue a career. Few people stayed during their prime. My parents did the same, Mum moving to teach abroad where she met my dad and moved back here to have me and my sister. I did the same when I grew up. Not much went on in the village. There was lots of gossip floating around between the neighbors, but that's expected. Mostly people got on well and invited each other for BBQs and bonfires. One thing that everyone agreed on, however, was the Toe Witch. The village believed the land was to blame. Resting between the forests, our little patch of land led to the perfect hiding place for a witch many years ago. Some people speculated that her bones were buried deep beneath our homes. Others thought she cursed the village to make sure she would always return. Whatever happened, they believed she was still there. The story goes that the Toe Witch slept or lived under your bed. During the night, she waited for you to pop out a foot and she would crawl out, bite off a toe or two and go back into hiding. The stories varied depending on who you spoke to, each with its own plot holes and gory new detail. I don't know whether I believed in the Toe Witch before that night. I probably did, being only 10. So, why did all my family and most people I knew have all their toes? Well, we were prepared. Each bed in each house had posts. A net or curtain would be draped around the bed and, as an extra precaution, tucked under the mattress. That's what my parents did anyway. I bet every house had their own little method to keep her at bay. The only time the witch was mentioned between the neighbors was one of those nights around the bonfire, stories and hushed whispers. Another, and the times I remember most, was when I was tucked into bed and my parents kissed my head. Good night, don't let the Toe Witch bite. Weird? Probably. I was a kid, so it felt pretty normal to me. Anyway, I don't think I lost much sleep over it. There wasn't many empty houses in the village, but there was a few, and they sat in urgent need of care and attention, rotting into the ground. One day, however, a van pulled up. A large white van, far too new and pristine to be here where everything was mud and wellies. Men in overalls began hauling in ladders and paint, setting up cement mixers and carrying huge panels of wood. I remember my mum twitching the curtains in our front room and beckoning my dad over. The phone rang off the hook as all the neighbors were doing the same. That night, we hosted a bonfire and the conversation was only about the potential new neighbors. I don't remember what exactly was said, just a lot about how they couldn't buy it. There must have been some law to stop them, going to the council, that kind of thing. I remember hoping they had children, preferably my age. I was quite excited. Months passed. My village fought it as far as they could, but soon enough, the new neighbors moved into their new beautiful home, which stood out a mile from the others with its picket fence and rose bushes. I don't know much about what happened next. My village was a friendly one and we did our best to welcome our new neighbors. Nothing they could do now they'd moved in, I guess. The family joined us on walks and gatherings. They had 2 sons, one my age and an older one my sister followed around like a lost sheep, flicking her hair, giggling really high-pitched. I'd stand behind him when she was there, pulling kissing faces so she'd go bright red, the usually annoying sibling stuff. All seemed good for a few weeks. They moved in the height of winter. Duck feather duvets and heated blankets were a must, and they complained a lot about the cold and the lack of road access in the snow. Yeah, they were pretty much stuck. We were used to it, but they obviously didn't expect it. The villagers told them about the legends surrounding the witch. I heard my dad telling my mum they had a conversation about it at the pub. Mum mentioned it when the neighbor's mum came for coffee. Neighbors told them at our bonfires. Each time, they laughed it off. The mum told her boy not to worry as they were just stories. This made one of the older villagers cross. He told her not to dismiss these legends and raves about how they need to respect the elders of the land if they wanted to be a part of our community, something like that. I don't remember much, but I remember the tension as everyone turned in for an early night. They must have thought we were crazy. The boy and his big brother asked me and my sister one eve about the witch. No, we'd never seen her. Yes, we had all our toes. Yes, we sleep with curtains on our bed like royalty. No, we don't have proof other than one old man that has 2 toes on 1 foot. They seemed unimpressed by our answers but continued to pry. I didn't know what to tell them. I was young and hadn't really been questioned about this before. I didn't understand why it was such a big deal. Just don't put your feel outside the bed. What's the problem? A few nights later, when the boy and I played in my room, he told me about the plan he and his brother had come up with. They were going to set up a video recorder, prop it on the windowsill and sleep with one foot out of the bed. I felt anxious. Told him he couldn't do that, but he shrugged it off. I didn't know what to do. After he left, I did the most noble thing and told my mom. She frowned, scrunched her nose and asked me if they were both going to do it. What an odd question, I thought. Yes? I answered. She smiled. That's fine, the witch only comes when you're alone, and went back to washing up. The boy couldn't wait to show me his toes and tell me he was a survivor the next morning. His older brother just rolled his eyes and told him he wasn't a survivor because there wasn't anything he survived. It wasn't real. I shrugged and went back to whatever I was playing when my sister come into the room. It won't happen when someone else is there, she leant up the doorframe. I shot a glare at her. The older brother laughed. Of course it won't. Should have known. After they'd left, I asked her what she thought she was doing. Apparently he deserved it. She added no context and walked off. Don't mess with my sister, boys. The next day, we were all awoken by screams and slamming doors. My mum ran downstairs in her dressing gown, followed by my dad pulling on his slippers. They opened the front door and were met with my new friend's mom running around holding her head and the dad trailing behind, carrying his oldest son. Blood pooled whenever he stood still, staining the white snow with the thick red glue pouring from him. A sickly feeling built in the pit of my stomach. I looked at the dripping rag tied around him. I didn't think much about why he was hurt at the time. It was all a bit of a blur. Dad sprang into action and ran to wake the doctor and help take the boy to the surgery. Mum threw me and the neighbor's son into our house and shut the door. We sat there on the carpet, his face pale and vacant. It was then that I felt the overwhelming dread of what might have happened to him. Was it her? I asked. He nodded. I thought of how much blood there was. I didn't realize a toe could bleed like. She took his leg. The boy interrupted, deep in thought. To the knee. He didn't cry, he barely moved, then he looked at me. What is it? I asked. He reached into his coat and pulled out a video camera, so big on him I don't know how he hid it. I need to see her. He began to open the camera. No. I grabbed it from him. You've seen enough. The boy grabbed it back and we scuffed. No. He screamed. We need to know, this can't go on, we can stop her. My heroic child brain was too shocked to argue. The boy looked almost animal. I nodded softly as he opened the camera and pressed play. We skipped a few hours of footage. First was a lot of him turning, sitting up, checking the bed. Then he stopped still. He had obviously fallen asleep. About an hour after, we saw something. Stop there. Rewind. The boy stopped, rewound and pressed play. Something moved, slowly under the frame of the bed, a sort of scraping from one side of the frame, all the way to the other. After a minute, the thing began to crawl up the large wooden bed frame. It stretched out. It was a hand, fingers crudely bent at unnatural angles, too long to function properly, wriggling and writhing in different directions. An arm next, bony and bent. Another arm identical to the first grew from under the bed. Both the arms stretched wide to the sides of the double bed, holding onto the posts. When in place, the thing hoisted itself up. A head emerged next, pointed cheekbones and sunken black eyes. The head turned all the way around, assessing its surroundings and snapping, unnatural movements. I was too scared not to look. I was frozen, so was my friend next to me. I don't know what we expected in our moment of shock and confusion, but it wasn't this. The gigantic arms allowed it to pull its body out from under the darkness. The body that emerged was long and pale. There were no legs. The body was almost snake-like, but the skin more human. The head slowly made its way to his brother, who still slept, not moving. The witch began to open its mouth. Its head snapped back, swinging from one side to another. She opened her jaw to release a long tongue. Her whole body seemed so unnatural and uncomfortable, like she didn't have control of the clunky movements. She dropped her head, seeming too heavy to hold upright, to the side and lowered herself to the bed, shifting towards his foot. The angle of her head made it difficult to see what was happening, but we knew. A minute went by until there was a crunch. He didn't wake. She moved up and the crunch came again, yet he slept. Her head flopped the other side so we could see more of what was happening. Its mouth was open so wide its eyes were facing up to the ceiling while her jaw, unhinged, rested on the bed. This happened twice more until he twitched. It froze for a second. He moved again, his brow frowning and a tear trickling down his face. In an instant, like when you let go of a balloon, the thing whipped back, hitting the bed frame, the dressing table and bouncing backwards off the set of drawers as if being sucked in from below. It wasn't seconds after that he began to scream, lifting his bloodied stump off the bed, blood spurting everywhere and his mum bursting and clapping her hands to her mouth in horror. As I stared, I was sure I could still see a long, curled finger hiding under the bed. Just before the camera turns off, you see my friend run in and retrieve it before being ushered out by his dad. I looked at my friend, his eyes fixed on the small square screen. I told him it was real, he said. He didn't believe you all. I didn't know what to say, the whole day was a blur. It wasn't the only incident, just the first one from my memory, and surprisingly, the family continued to live there. The whole ordeal is, however, what inspired me to become a writer and researcher, exploring myths and legends around the world. I can assure you that many of the locations I've visited, I've found no truth of the myths that supposedly reside there, but some of them have proven to be far more creepier and far more disturbing than our tow witch. Posted by you/CharlieG92. Why I don't take my work home. It was January of 1993. Everything was bleak, cold, wet and miserable. Fog consumed the streets, lamps cast little light, and I could hear the odd car trudge through the slurries and ice in a slow hum. It was a little before 10 p.m. and I was still expecting a delivery from the local museum. I didn't expect it to arrive that evening, not with the weather conditions being so treacherous, but a knock at the door, breaking the otherwise silent night, startled me. I lived alone then, in a townhouse on a long street opposite a small park usually filled with dog walkers, runners and families picnicking during the summer. The park wasn't huge, but it was the only one within walking distance in the middle of the city. Although pleasant during the daylight, looking through my window trying to see who stood at the top of the steps to my front door, the park looked unsettlingly empty. The knock came again. I answered and a man thrust a large box towards me. He smiled, rubbed his hands together and bounced from foot to foot in the freezing cold while I signed the paper he'd laid on top of the box. Juggling the box in one hand, I thanked the man and kicked the door shut with my foot, back into the warmth. I was glad it had arrived. That meant I could process the artifacts tomorrow and get them sent to the post office before closing or even the day after if need be. I was too tired to start now, and after polishing off a bottle of red wine, I thought it time to go to bed and start afresh in the morning. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a crack coming from my stairway, nothing unusual for an old house connected to neighbors on either side. I often heard what my father used to describe as the house settling, you know, the noises, pipes, stairs, a creak, a crack. Anything makes noise when the world around you is engulfed in silence. I didn't usually wake up during the night, especially after a drink, but I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned for a few minutes until I heard something else. This time it sounded heavy. A thud. And then another. I sat up, still half asleep. I noticed my door was open a few inches. I always shut my door. This should have panicked me more than it did. When you do something so unconsciously every night, you can't think clearly about the last time you did it. The door drifted to the back of my mind as my eyelids grew heavy and my body calmed. Another thud. The house was in darkness. I stared towards the door, trying to focus, trying to stay awake. Towards the bottom of the door, a few inches from the floor, there was a dark mass, darker than its surroundings. I wasn't sure if it was my eyes or my tired confusion, but it was moving up so slowly that I didn't want to blink, and my thoughts instantly shifted to the package waiting in my living room. Without averting my gaze, I reached for the lamp just left of my bed, slowly groped for the switch and turned it on. The shape was gone, there was nothing there. The black shadow didn't exist, and I could see clearly onto the landing, the pictures that hung in the corridor and the banister to the stairwell. I felt a sense of unease and left the light on low as I tried to coax myself back to sleep. As soon as I woke, I remembered my dream. The shadow so dark and the anxious pit in my stomach churning. I set to work shortly after. Taking a hammer, I began working at the nails holding the box together. They were tacked in deep, far better secured than my usual deliveries, but, somehow, I knew how important this delivery was. Inside a few layers of packaging and dust sheets lay the find, two heads facing each other. They were so corroded that it was difficult to initially pick out any features or expressions. I picked one up and laid it under the light. All I knew about them was that they were found buried under part of the Antonine Wall and were thought to be from around 142 AD. After hours of testing, researching and writing reports, I boxed up the pieces as carefully as I could and continued with my day. Looking back, there was nothing unique about the pieces, nothing I hadn't seen before, but there was something off with them, a feeling or an energy. I can't explain it, but I wish I'd have trusted my gut on this one. I ended the night similarly to the one before, except for the drink. The weather was still horrendous and I didn't bother going to get another bottle, so I went to bed, ready to post the artifacts back first thing in the morning. It took me a while of watching rubbish TV to get to sleep, still on edge from the night before. 2 a.m. Like the previous night, I heard something. As I stared at the crack in the doorway, it began to grow wider. Something was there, much more visible than before. A huge, dark shape blocked my only exit. A human figure stood menacingly just meters away. Although I could see no expression in the darkness, I knew it was staring at me. I could see its chest rise and fall in rapid succession. Its fingers wriggled and writhed at its sides. Sweat pooled on my brow, tears falling from my face stained my pillow. I couldn't move, I was trapped. It felt like so much time had passed. I was conscious of every breath, feeling like the air around me was growing thin as my heart thumped in my ears. I wanted it to pounce, to have me, to end the fear and all-consuming anxiety. The shape began to crouch, its arms pulling over its head and its legs pulling up to its face as it scuttled across the floor. I squeezed my eyes closed, desperate for the dream to end. I don't know where it came from, but the adrenaline finally kicked in and I lunged for the door. I bounced off the frame and swung around the banister. I heard the greatest thumps and thuds, like a huge dog, behind me. Just before I set off down the stairs, something banged into me and I lost my footing. I awoke sometime later, pain electrified my body, my head blistered and my legs were numb. I tried to lift just enough to look around. A small light was coming from a doorway above me. I was at the bottom of the stairs. I looked down at my legs, they were twisted and tangled in positions that made my stomach churn, added with the strong metallic smell that filled my nostrils. I leant my head to the side, retching as the world around me spun. As the wave passed, I looked towards the stairs. I tried to shout, to scream or to cry, but nothing happened. The light suddenly became blocked. The mass stood still, casting a long stretched shadow onto the stairs. I began to believe, whether it was through being in and out of consciousness and definitely concussed, that I had scared myself into falling down. I heard a click and simultaneously, I was in darkness. Everything became dark, darker than I ever experienced. The air felt thick and heavy to breathe and the walls felt like they were closing in and the air escaping. I couldn't tell what sounds were in my head and which were down here with me. I lay, waiting, to be found or to die, to be rescued or to wake up. As I sat, listening to my blood drip into a puddle, I felt tugging, nibbling as whiskers and fur brushed my face. I felt nothing other than that, no pain. I stopped thinking about the mass, about the heads. I stopped thinking altogether and listened to the nibbling and rummaging until I felt myself fall through the cold stone beneath me. The sunlight shone through my front door window. It took me a second to get my bearings, to realize I was, in fact, at the bottom of my stairs. My legs were most definitely broken and the vomit had begun to crust on the side of my face. In front of me, as I lay hopelessly with my 1 foot still on the bottom 2 steps, I saw a sight that still haunts me. The heads sat at my eye line, on the bottom step, their expressionless faces piercing into me. I have never since felt so helpless and sickeningly horrified. The next 20 minutes are a blur to me. I'm grateful that this was a time of landlines and the phone sat on the table not a few feet from my grasp, although it wasn't easy to get to. After that, I remember the relief I felt when the police broke the door down and I wasn't alone. I told my story, which was sort of accepted due to the absolute state my apartment was in and the missing artifacts along with all my research. I however know what happened. I wasn't robbed. I opened something that night that shouldn't have been messed with. It was buried for a reason and I welcomed it into my home. I now conduct all research from my office at my workplace and I absolutely do not take my work home.